first off, as you know, first part of your grounds maintenance project is due next week. It'll be great. Don't worry. It's just a good way. It's just a good way to get feedback. But just think of it that way. Oh, the grounds maintenance project. When it's due, don't worry about it. It's just a good time to get feedback. Just view it that way. So other than that, I am actually going to introduce you to today's speaker, Matt Jones. He is the horticulture agent for Chatham County. He's been there since May. Previously, he was in Harnett County for about 2.5 years. Prior to that, he worked for California Extension as a research associate for pecans, pistachios, that kind of stuff, and lots of other impressive stuff, you know, grad school, worked with the Harvard Arboretum, all these things. That's basically accurate.
It's the story of my personality. I'm kind of a weird guy now.
Yeah. School has weirded him out. So with that, I am going to let Matt take it away.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for having me. So today's class will be in 2 parts, first and second half. The first part of the class, I'll give a intro or basic lecture into plant pathology and diseases that in some ways parallels the disease chapter in the book, just so we're all on the same page. And then after our, sounds like to be a luxurious break, social committee looks awesome here. Then we'll do a diagnostic exercise where you'll get into groups and you get to role play. Some of you will be volunteers, and then one of you in each group will be a client, and you get to torture the volunteers. So be as evilly evil as you can imagine. And there'll be a series of 3 different examples of diseases that the volunteers have to diagnose based on the information the client provides them. So what I may do then, there'll be some slides in here that you may have the printouts for that I'll skip over, but you can refer to later, just so we can get to the meat of the diagnostic exercise. And it will require some research on your part, so have your smart or so-called smart devices with you, and that will help you find some of the answers. So for the disease lecture, several objectives.
Oh, it stopped clicking.
Oh wait, there's an on switch. Okay. So we're going to be able to distinguish between what are disease symptoms and what are not. You might be surprised at what is normal. And then distinguish between an abiotic disease and a biotic disease. One is caused by, a biotic disease is caused by a pathogen of some sort, and abiotic disease is some physiological, environmental, cultural induced issue. We'll introduce some of the common terms that plant pathologists use to describe the disease symptoms that should assist you in helping to research and find out what the problem is in any given case. And then a little bit on the biology and symptoms caused by the fungi, bacteria, viruses, and nematodes, the organisms that cause disease symptoms in plants. So again, the first thing to recognize is that normal can be weird looking. You really, before you can have a proper framework for assessing if a plant has a disease, you need to know what it looks like in its healthy state. And there are some features or characteristics that can be a bit deceptive. For example, anyone know this is the tip of a juniper? Is that concerning to anyone? Perhaps? If you saw that, would you know what that is? That's actually the male cone. Okay, so that's well, males are arguably defective. In certain situations, this is how the plant is going to behave. It's reverse everything, so it's funny. And these and other features, particularly on non-flowering plants like gymnosperms or ferns, understand how they reproduce, so you don't misdiagnose a anatomical feature. And then there are some. This is a honey locust, a variety of honey locust, where in its healthy state the leaves are a bright gold yellow. That's not a nutrient deficiency. That's how they're supposed to look. Likewise, if you see marginal chlorosis or something on some plants, in this Lamium maculatum, I believe. No, sorry, that's viburnum and Lamium. But that variegation has been bred into the plant for a specific aesthetic look, but it's not a disease symptom. Likewise, you want to know what a lichen is. It's a dual organism, arguably a triple organism, depending on who you ask. But it's algae and fungal spores growing symbiotically. And while these can grow on plants, they are not causing disease. Okay? They sometimes an excess of lichens be indicative of slow growth because the bark is not shedding at its normal rate. But they are not a cause of disease, but maybe a symptom of stress, depending on the environment. Likewise, as with the gymnosperms, the ferns reproduce in a dramatically different way than flowering plants. They produce spores in sporangia that occur underneath the leaves, typically, in most fern groups. So these little growths are not some dramatic fungal disease, but in fact how the fern is reproducing. Likewise, some things like exfoliating bark can be a character trait of particular species, so it may not be a bad thing. And then some things that appear in the landscape are nothing to be concerned about, as horrifying as they might look. And some of you might be familiar with dog vomit fungus, which is neither vomit from a dog nor actually a fungus, but it is a slime mold, right? And it will occur sporadically in certain times of year, and usually in mulches and whatnot. And what it's doing here is reproducing, so it's getting ready to produce spores. And so certain environmental characteristics will cause the organisms to congregate and produce this lovely texture. But it'll be gone in a few days, and if you're not a master gardener volunteer until you've got a call about this. So just tell them, don't worry, it's dog vomit. And it only harms children under the age of 10. Then the effect, particularly of biotic diseases that they have on plants, can take many forms. They occur on all parts of the plant. There are some diseases that occur in the roots, some at the crown, some on leaves, some on fruit, some on flowers. And the symptoms that the pathogen produces will vary among different pathogens. And plant pathologists have derived certain sets of, they've derived certain names to describe different sets of symptoms. So I'm going to run through some of those symptoms. And just so you know, when you're reading about a disease, these are not vague, well, usually not too vague descriptors that the author is throwing out. These refer to specific symptom forms in plants. So, for example, a spot is anything that is some roughly circular lesion, and often these occur you find these on leaves. Typically, you won't find a spot described on a canker, but you can find it on leaves and fruit tissue or even petals. They can vary a lot in color and shape, but what's happening is the pathogenic organism will colonize one part of the tissue and then is spreading outward concentrically. So in this case, for example, which is Cebu apple rust on apple, you find that the organism colonized the center here, it grew outward, the initially infected tissue is now necrotic, it's brown, it's died completely. The area where it's actively infecting the tissue is more yellow or chlorotic, and where it's just entering the tissue is more red, so it's kind of this bullseye pattern. That's just an indication of the pathogen spreading in the leaf. Other times it's not quite as elegant. This is lake blight, I think, in tomato, and while the colors don't change, it does have a nice bullseye pattern in the spot itself. But they can be very minuscule, they can be fleck-like, and they can occur on the upper side of the leaf, the underside of the leaf. It varies among pathogens and among different species. Another term is a blight. This is just to describe, this is not a word you want on your plant. Unless it's boxwood, there's boxwood blight. I can't stand boxwood, so I'm rooting for blight. But a blight is just a rapid general killing of either the entire plant or starting at leaves and proceeding to stems, leaves, stems, or stems. That's good. I've done this presentation 10 times and I just caught this typo. But it's a rapid dieback, and it usually is fatal. It's allowed to continue to affect what you do. There's not much you can do about it. This is a photo of the Phytophthora infestans on potato. Anyone know what that might be? Ireland, circa 1840s. This is the same pathogen that caused the Irish potato blight. That and repressive economic and social and political pressures put on by the tyrannical English government. And monoculture, and monoculture. But mostly it's the English school.
They didn't have the potato.
That's what happened to chestnut trees, right?
Yeah, there's a chestnut blight, correct? And yes, it's similar symptoms on the tree. Yeah, an entire, a critical part of the ecosystems of all East Coast forests is now gone because of a fungal pathogen called the chestnut blight. Another disease symptom is a canker. This is just a sunken lesion. General term for a sunken lesion. Most often it occurs on stems. You should find a description of a stem canker. Occasionally, once or twice on the crown, but usually on it's a type of stem symptom. And depending on the age of the tissue, it can take different appearances. When it's young, you can just see discoloration, kind of randomly distributed on the stem. Other times it will take out, it won't be so sunken, but you'll find a dieback in a certain portion of the stem. And then on woody tissue, as it grows around and over the initial canker, you can get some pretty dramatic deformations. Yeah?
I just have a totally different question. Would it be possible to move the computer out of that and do a desk over there?
You want to keep testing your
This whole room is having
That's part of the fun. Okay, so where would you like to go?
Well, it's working. You go and skip, and then you pull that off. So
I can go podium free if needed. I'm a podium kind of guy. I just wanted you all to.
Oh, sorry.
I'm trying to support the chiropractic industry. Sorry about that. And I was doing that. Okay.
Thank you.
Is that any better?
Tell me what I'm doing. Oh my God. So it's going to be smaller because it's not as far back. No, we don't
Let's go right now.
I can't do anything straight anyway, so.
We're just going to.
So, sorry.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Then another symptom is general discoloration. This can usually takes two descriptors. A chlorotic discoloration is a yellowing, so green tissue turning yellow. Necrotic discoloration is totally the death of the tissue, so it looks brown or black or gray. And then this discoloration can be distributed in different ways. It can be called interveinal, which means it occurs everywhere but the veins. So if it's interveinal chlorosis, the veins remain green and the rest of the leaf tissue, for example, remains yellow. It can also be described as marginal, so it occurs only on the margin or perimeter of the leaf. It can be a combination of both, depending if the disease is progressing. In this case, it began as a interveinal chlorosis, but proceeded to interveinal necrosis. And then the distribution of the discoloration can be an important factor too. Is it occurring on older leaves, on younger leaves, or both? Is it starting in one part of the plant, or is it uniform over the entire plant? All those can be important indicators. Often, chloroses are associated with nutrient deficiency of some sort, or a nutrient toxicity, or excess salts. Saltburn, for example, is often manifest as marginal damage, marginal necrosis. And then I'll add too, on with nutrient deficiency symptoms, if you are finding that it is the new growth that is looking chlorotic, that could indicate a certain set of nutrient deficiency. If it is occurring on older growth, that would imply that it might be a different set of nutrients. Dieback is a bit more of a loosey-goosey term, but it's generally something, a death that tends to start at the tip. So it's stems going from the outside in. So there are several fungal dieback diseases seen in conifers, and some others on rhodies and a few others. As this is, for example, Phytophthora, again a relative of Phytophthora infestans, but on rhododendron that began at the tip and is proceeding inward. Galls are any swelling or tumor-like growth on a plant, and this can occasionally these growths can be caused by a cultural or environmental factor, something in the life history of the plant. Usually that's called a burl, though, but a gall is commonly caused by a bacterial infection. There is a common one in grapes called crown gall. This is caused by a bacterium called Agrobacterium tumefaciens, and the bacteria will insert a gene into the plant genome that will tell it to produce, that will induce a series of hormone reactions, and then cause it to produce basically a food supply for the bacteria. And then that's the bacteria that's been engineered to be able to engineer other plants, actually. They take out the infectious genes and put in the genes they want. And so if you want to genetically modify organisms, for example, you can actually deliberately infect the plant with this modified bacteria and insert whatever gene you want. A mosaic or a model is kind of like a spot, but imagine that it's in a far higher resolution. So this is where you'll find small interspersed chloroses, basically, that occur all over the leaf. And often this is caused by a viral pathogen. So this is tobacco mosaic virus, for example, a very common and very simple plant virus. And you'll find that the leaves are not uniformly yellow, uniformly green, but it's almost as if every other cell is green and yellow. Rots are softening of tissue as a result of mostly decayed fungi. So this causes the whole tissue to feel soft and rotten and smelly and sour. They occur on roots and on fruits most commonly. So a root rot means that the roots have gotten too wet for too long, or they've been deprived of oxygen for too long. That enables other pathogens to basically penetrate the defenses of the plant and kill the plant outright. Root rots are either infections on or off the plant after the fruit's been harvested, but rapid decay of the fruit. Usually they're fungal, but there are bacterial cause rots too. Stunting, that's just as you might imagine, a term for dramatically slowed growth. So they either grow slowly or they fail to grow. And here's and this can be an effect of another kind of pathogen. So, for example, with Pythium root rot, not only are the roots rotting, but as a result of the inability of the plant to take up more water and nutrients and transpire and everything else, it can't undergo its normal growth processes, so it stops growing. Patchy lawns, for example, might indicate a form of stunting. In this case, it's failed to fill in because it's not producing its horizontal stems called stolons or runners. As I mentioned, lichens themselves are not a direct cause of they are not directly harming a plant. But if they are growing in excess on a plant, it could indicate that the rate of growth has slowed so that they're not being exfoliated at the normal rate. The exception here would be if we were way further west of here. In the mountains, it's a lot wetter and lichen can grow in a bit more favorable environments. But if you see a lot of lichen on a tree, it's not harming the tree directly, but the tree is struggling in some way. One of my favorite.
So next week we should have more lichen because of all the rain we're gonna get, right? It's a long-term thing.
Yeah. They're usually quite slow growing. Yeah. Among my favorite of diseases are wilts. And these are, the plant is unable to take up water and distribute water or transpire out through the stem and out the leaves. And this is because there's an infection of the tissue that does that process. It's infecting usually the xylem, occasionally the phloem. Usually it's the younger xylem growth, but these are fatal. If there a wilt disease has entered a plant, there's nothing you can apply, no matter how nasty the fungicide is. You can't do much about it. The only way around it is to have wilt-resistant varieties, and this is very common in tomatoes, for example. There are two common wilt diseases. Fusarium wilt is more common in our part of the state, and as you move further west, verticillium wilt can occur. But you'll notice on tomato seed packets or plants, they will indicate which diseases they are resistant to. If you see an F or an F1, F2, F3, that means they are Fusarium wilt resistant, or if you see a B1, 2, 3, verticillium wilt resistant. There are different, in plant pathology terms, they call them races, but it means different populations of these pathogens that some plants aren't always resistant to. So if you have, say, a race 3 Fusarium and your plant is only resistant to races 1 and 2, it will still get the wilt disease. There are one way to if the client brings in a plant or shows you a plant and it's wilting terribly despite ample water, and they look at the roots and the roots look fine, it hasn't been overwatered, then you might do a sacrificial vivisection and look at the stem tissue, and you'll find often that the xylem tissue, the outer xylem tissue, is in fact necrotic. It's brown, yellow, it looks unusual, then it's probably infected. That's for fungal wilts. As we'll see with bacterial wilts, we'll have it further that later, but there's a different way to diagnose it, the difference between a fungal cause and a bacterial cause. So most of those descriptors apply to biotic diseases, but there are also abiotic diseases. A biotic disease is caused by some pathogenic organism, bacteria, fungi, virus, nematode, which is actually an invertebrate, but traditionally covered in plant pathology. And then an abiotic disease is that caused by either environmental or local conditions. And one of the first steps you should ask yourself is to try to figure out, is this caused by a biotic issue or an abiotic issue, a non-pathogenic issue? So the symptoms tend to sort differently. A abiotic problem can appear suddenly. It will often affect many different species simultaneously. It tends not to spread after the event, and it tends to occur in more linear or geometric patterns. And you'll find often very distinct, or a lack of transition between healthy and diseased tissue. It goes from perfectly fine to perfectly not fine. A biotic disease, just imagine how a pathogen is infecting a plant. It's not going to happen all at once. So it's going to start gradually. Disease will keep spreading through the plants. It tends to be more host specific. So if your tomato is having a problem and your lettuce or whatever is not, then that may indicate a biotic issue. It will spread over time, so it just appears gradually but then spreads over time. The appearance in the landscape can be more random, or it could originate from one point and spread from there. Random meaning that it arrived into the environment in a random way. So this fungal spores, for example, were brought in from the wind or splashing water. All those things can create more random-looking patterns. In an ideal biotic disease symptom, you'll find a transition between infected tissue and tissue that's becoming infected and healthy tissue, like we saw with cedar apple rust on apple. This is a rough anecdotal number, but it's almost safer to assume that when a client brings in a problem, it's an abiotic problem. Start there, eliminating the possibilities of abiotic issues before proceeding to evaluating whether or not it is a pathogenic problem, a biotic problem. So start with abiotic. I can send, the University of Florida has a series of 3 publications on disease diagnostics. There are several diagnostic methods, and we'll go to this in the second lecture. The book has a good way to do it, but the Florida one is interesting because it strongly suggests let's eliminate the possibility of insects first, then eliminate the possibility of abiotic, and then if it's obviously more biotic in appearance, then start there. Many cultural problems can cause abiotic diseases. Improper planting is a pretty common one. I call these user errors. And these are also, unfortunately, the type of problem that the client doesn't want to hear about. They don't want to hear. They want the external universe to be the cause of their problems, not what they did, right? It's okay. Sidebar. What does it say about a society where we think there's a pill for every ill? Right? No. Look inward. Start there. Certain cultural practices can cause a lot of these problems. It can be poor plant selection. This is a very, very common thing. We're all guilty of, it says it tolerates, it prefers shade, but I'm going to try and put it in the sun. Like it. Or vice versa. Those sorts of things. Or, it says it likes well-drained soils, but it's clay, right? It's not a pond. Then one that's, you might be surprised how common this is, improper planting depth. Arborvitaes in the landscape are often planted too deeply. If you see, like in a hedge or something, someone has planted 5 or 6 arborvitaes in a row to block their really obnoxious neighbors, and then a year or 2 later, they all start to decline simultaneously. Look at the base of the plant. Have them send a photo of that, and if it looks like that there's no apparent root flare, like there's no transition from trunk to root flare, and it just looks like it's a hole in the ground, that means it's probably been planted too deeply, and those are really sensitive to that. And then a similar problem is volcano mulching, where it's kind of the unfortunate approach to things where if some is good, more is better. And landscapers are just guilty about this, but they put whole mountains, like little Mount Everest, around the base of the tree. And generally, is stem tissue supposed to be in the ground? No. We've got roots do that. And so if you're creating stuff around the stem is not going to like that. And you can, one, attract critters, voles, and also makes the stem tissue more vulnerable to infection. When we're planting trees, make sure the root flare is at the same grade level as the root flare. And improper pruning can be an issue too. If you wondered why, my shrub isn't flowering. Well, you pruned off all the buds. They were formed last year, and they're now gone, and they're not coming back for another year. More obvious things can also cause abiotic problems: extremes of temperatures, extremes of water and lack of water. So freeze damage can manifest in different ways, but usually you'll find the whole tissue limping or wilting in some way. You'll see marginal necroses, and obviously it corresponds to some climatic event. So photosynthesis, very needed to understand context. Has there been a freeze recently? Was this planted too early? Was it before the last frost, for example? And usually these symptoms are caused because as water expands, it crystallizes and it ruptures plant cells. So that happens over a large area, you get tissue collapse. And then too much heat or too much light can cause problems too. Leaf scorch. This can be as what's happening is the plant cannot cool itself off fast enough through transpiration for one means or another. So the external, the perimeter marginal tissue start to die. In other cases, if tissues are accustomed to shade and they're suddenly exposed to a lot of light, they cannot handle all of those photons, and so that tissue gets damaged. It's common in peppers. If there's an insect that comes along and eats a leaf and reveals a pepper, and then suddenly that pepper is exposed to a lot of sun and will cause localized necrosis. So this looks kind of pathogenic, right? You see this kind of rotting pattern, but it's not. It is totally abiotic. Too much water, too little water are both stressful. With insufficient water, you learn about transpiration, right? Okay, so a plant can have some control over how much water it transpires by opening or closing its stomata. If there is sufficient water, the stomata are open, and water will evaporate out. At the same time, carbon dioxide can come in. But there's a certain point at which the plant says, no more. I cannot take any more water loss. I will close my stomata, will not take up any more water. And so this does not necessarily mean it's non-recoverable. With addition of more water, it can recover. But another consequence of drought can be slower growth. If the stomata are closed because the plant is trying not to lose water, it cannot do what? It cannot photosynthesize because it can't take in CO2. That's the other half of the photosynthetic business. Remember, light is used to assemble carbon dioxide into more complex carbon compounds like sugars and starches and everything else. Rot can be an issue too, as I mentioned. Do plants consume oxygen? They do consume oxygen. Okay, they need oxygen to break down the starches and sugars they've made in photosynthesis. When a plant is actively growing, however, the net effect is that it's photosynthesizing more than it's respiring. So they are releasing more oxygen than they're consuming, but they still need oxygen just like we do to break down their foods that they make in photosynthesis. So if the roots are lacking oxygen from too much water or too much soil compaction, then they will starve to death. They cannot get the oxygen they need to break down the sugars they stored. They spent all year storing, and then now you're drowning them. Similarly, so that can be one cause of death, but also wetter conditions tend to favor pathogens. So it can be a two-for-one deal there. I already mentioned somewhat, but nutrient deficiencies is considered an abiotic problem. The plant cannot get enough nutrients from the soil, or the nutrients are, due to other environmental conditions, misallocated in some way. So sometimes this can be pH induced. pH is the measure of acidity of the soil. 7 is neutral. Anything less than 7 is considered acidic. Anything more than 7 is considered alkaline. And the pH of the soil will affect how readily plants can extract nutrients, essentially. And so if the pH is off, even though there are sufficient nutrients in the soil, the plant can't efficiently extract those nutrients. So, and then similarly, there's a physiological condition called blossom end rot in tomato, which you need to be familiar with. This is nominally a localized calcium deficiency. So the opposite, the end opposite of the pedestal on the tomato, the bottom of the tomato, you'll see tissue collapse, and it's because the plant cannot get enough calcium to developing fruit fast enough. But that does not necessarily mean it is a lack of calcium in the soil. Okay, it's usually, and because calcium is dissolved in water, the leaf is better at getting the water to it through transpiration than the tomato is. So the leaf gets the lion's share of the calcium, and the tomato is left collapsing. So usually, in many cases, making sure that tomatoes have sufficient and even watering can resolve loss of end rot issues better than throwing a bunch of additional calcium. Salt burn, this is kind of an indirect effect of drought or lack of water. The salts in the soil in excess can affect how plants take up other salts and water and other things that will cause the leaves to essentially dry out and harden. Herbicides can also cause symptoms, and some herbicides on some plants cause very distinct symptoms, but often it's very vague and hard to diagnose herbicide injury. If you go to the NC State Weeds portal, so weeds.ces.ncsu.edu, Dr. Joe Neal has a whole mini webpage of herbicide injury symptoms, and they're classified by the different mechanisms that herbicides operate. But still, it can be hard to diagnose if you really have trouble, tell Ashley. And then if necessary, Ashley can consult Dr. Neal. But one of the really distinct ones is 2,4-D. This herbicide in its standard form readily aerosolizes, so it usually propagates the air, spreads the air, and through drift. So if you're applying it over here, if it's even mildly windy, the herbicide can drift, the chemical can drift easily. And if it hits a non-target plant, it can exhibit symptoms. Anything in the grape family are notoriously sensitive to this chemical. So even a little bit of drift can cause the leaves to curl up like that. Likewise, with glyphosate and some other herbicides, incidental contact can cause various symptoms that vary among species. But if it looks like it's appearing near an area where an herbicide was applied, that might be a good place to start in your diagnostic process. Another thing that this is, let's see, what's my next slide? Yeah, line trimmer damage. This is usually caused by husbands, where they get too close to the trunk and you ended up removing really important outer tissue on the stem. This could include phloem, so that's the tissue that takes the sugars made in the leaves down to the roots. So if you do it too much and you end up going around the entire tree, you're girdling the tree, removing all connection the roots have with the top of the plant, and thus the roots will start to death. So it's helpful to both scold your husbands and to apply additional mulch around the base of landscape plants to deter them from doing that. The women are laughing, they know it's true. Other things, my second day at the Art Arboretum, the arborist always intimidated me, so it was a really dramatic experience for me. But there was a lightning strike the night before, and this, what was it? I think it was a fir. Lightning strike made the tree explode. There was a tree 100 feet in every direction, and I had to clean it up. But so that occasionally happens. Even in large agricultural fields, you'll see this random dead spot, and if the pathologist will be pulling their hair out, like, what caused this? And it turns out it was just a localized lightning strike. So that can be occasional issues. And if there are holes in the leaves after a rainstorm, and there wasn't a biblical plague of locusts or Japanese beetles the day before, it might simply be hail damage. Example. Okay. So back to biotic diseases, though. These are diseases caused by pathogens. And I forgot to quote later, but I just love that the Greek word is producer of suffering. And this is anything. This is an organism that is causing problems on another organism. These causal organisms can be fungi, bacteria, viruses, and then everything in between. There are some strange fungal relatives that don't look and behave too much like fungi. And the nematodes, as I said, even though they're invertebrates, they have traditionally been the domain of plant pathology in the world of academia. But a disease requires three components, and this is described as a disease triangle. This is the diagram that most people reference. And just like with a triangle, if any part of the vertex, if any part of the triangle is removed, the triangle collapses. So you need all three of these components in order for a a disease to occur. And that would be, you need to have a pathogen present. If there's no pathogen present, there'll be no infectious disease. You need to have the pathogen that is on a host that is susceptible to that pathogen. Some plants are resistant to other diseases, others are not. And then it has to be in the right condition to cause infection. So if the pathogen is on the host, but it's too dry, or it's too much sun for the pathogen, then the infection will not occur. If it's a really favorable environment for disease for that particular plant, but there's no spores present, then the disease will not occur. Likewise, if the pathogen is in a great environment but it has no host that it can attack, then that disease will also not occur. So all these factors need to be present for diseases to occur. Biotic diseases tend to be restricted to certain hosts, and this can, you might, hear about an anthracnose on one plant, and anthracnose on another plant, a not closely related species. So the pathogen is genetically related to that other pathogen, but because we're dealing with different hosts, it's usually a different species, subspecies, or race of a pathogen. So they really are host specific. A disease is not going to go from your tomato to your oak tree to your grass. Okay. They tend to start off slowly and they tend to be infected and then progressively get worse rather. And as I said, there tends to be a transition zone between healthy and infected tissue, and they can survive through multiple seasons through special protective bodies or forms. There are both sclerotia, which are a special form of a fungal propagule that can survive really harsh conditions, and then spores themselves produced sexually or asexually can also survive a lot more extreme conditions than the fungal body can. Fungi themselves, but we're talking about fungi here. They're a group of microscopic eukaryotes, so they're related to animals and plants. In fact, they're technically more closely related to animals than they are plants. They exist primarily as a body of thread-like cells that are spreading in many directions simultaneously. And that body of thread-like cells, either in the soil or growing through other organisms, is how the fungi mainly operates. It's secreting enzymes, it's digesting other living tissue, and then growing into that area. Once they are a sufficient size and with a sufficient other resources and nutrients, then they can reproduce. And what you see as a mushroom, for example, is just the reproductive structure of a fungus. Most of the body is underground, growing through the soil, right? Likewise, on plants and other host tissue, they will produce some sort of reproductive structure at some point. And that can be very helpful for identification. That's also how they spread. Pathologists distinguish between a saprophyte, which feeds on dead tissue, versus a parasite, which is feeding on living tissue. They have really delightfully complex sex lives, and there can be many different mating types, so dozens of different sexes effectively that have to get together to reproduce sexual spores. But in many cases, they can also produce asexual spores. And usually it's the asexual spores that are easier to produce and can be a more common infectious agent. Sometimes, in the case of things like rusts, the different sexual spores can require different hosts, dramatically different hosts. In the aforementioned cedar apple rust, one phase of the life cycle grows on apple leaves, and the other phase grows on conifers, mostly junipers. Then when and the majority of biotic diseases are caused by fungi. They are when in doubt, start with assuming it. If you know it's a biotic disease, you can sort of start by assuming it's a fungus just out of sheer probability. But think about the symptoms first. When a spore lands, just an example, when a spore lands on a plant tissue, it will germinate and produce special structures designed to penetrate plant tissue. As we'll see in a second, bacterial pathogens require an opening, but many fungi can circumvent the protective armor that many plants have. So the thick cell walls, thick cuticles, but fungi can often get around that. They cause all sorts of different, I gotta hit myself, of course, different disease symptoms. Many things I mentioned in the first part of the lecture can all be caused by fungi. Has anyone seen this orange alien blob on conifers before? It's a beautiful thing, really. And it can be freak people out with it, but it's just a form of the life cycle of cedar apple rust where it's dispersing, I think, asexual spores in this state, asexual spores in this state. And then it's like on a juniper, it looks like a Christmas tree ornament from hell. But, or something out of some H.P. Lovecraft novel. But it really doesn't harm the juniper too much. They can survive a pretty heavy infestation of this. It is a native pathogen. It's not invasive. It's not from a different environment. So most of the hosts can tolerate various degrees of infection. But on apples, like I said, it appears quite differently. That's two different forms of spores. We'll go through some of these relatively quickly. So it's beautiful. Black spotted rose. If you're into roses, I won't judge you. The symptoms, this is caused by a fungal pathogen, and the spots tend to appear relatively dry. Some infections, particularly bacterial infections, can be wet in appearance. But you'll find that there's a central black spot, or a circular black spot that has sometimes a yellow fringe that then proceeds into chlorosis of the entire leaf. On the stems, you might see purplish spots, and this tends to occur in late spring. And the spores overwinter on debris that's fallen off the plant. So one way to reduce the source of inoculum for future infection is to make sure you've removed infected debris from the base of the plant. And they're disseminated from that debris through splashing water. And splashing water is a very common cause of spore distribution, from rain, from irrigation, anything. All it takes is one tiny droplet that has a spore in it, and voila, you have this infection. So managing this disease is usually a combination of planting appropriate disease-resistant roses, removing infectious debris, pruning back anything that has infected and keeping it away from the rest of the plant. There are fungicides that can reduce the rate of infection, and like fungicides in most cases, they are preventative. They prevent further infection. They don't cure existing infection per se. So if you have this issue, I'd suggest planting something else. But if there's a particular variety cultivar rose that you adore, then you might require, once infection occurs, it might require frequent use of fungicides, unfortunately. I won't go into too much on these, but another fun one is southern stem blight or southern wilt. This is not a wilt disease per se, but more a blight in its behavior on the plant. It's a disease of many vegetable crops, but primarily on solanaceous crops, so eggplants, tomatoes, and peppers. And you'll find that the lower stems start to die back, the leaves wilt, yellowing occurs, and the diagnostic character for this is the presence of sclerotia. So look at the base of the plant, and if you see a lot of small, hard, white bodies, those are the sclerotia. Those are the protective superspores of the fungus. And there's no fungicides available from homeowners, probably thankfully, to manage this. So it's a matter of rotating out of that soil for 3 or 4 years. The sclerotia, while durable or not, they don't last forever. So if you plant something like a grass in that area, hopefully a native ornamental grass, not turf, then the problem won't go away over Root rots, again, this is Phytophthora infestans. There are many Phytophthora species. This is probably the coolest named. What does anyone know what it means? So phyto is plant, thora is destroyer in Greek. So Phytophthora infestans is infectious destroyer. This is a water mold. It behaves kind of like a fungus, but it's not a fungus. It's a whole different set of organisms. But at one stage of their life cycle, they can swim. And to swim, what do you need? Water. So if the conditions are frequently wet, these things will thrive. They'll swim to where they can get vulnerable tissue and take out the plant. So usually this is an issue of poor drainage. Okay, bacteria. Before being a recovering botanist, I was a recovering microbiologist. So I have some affinity for bacteria. And these are much simpler organisms. They are unicellular rather than multicellular like fungi, most fungi. And they divide rapidly by fission, so that means they can multiply very rapidly. And then they can both be autotrophic, so some are photosynthetic, and others, many others though, are heterotrophic, so they consume energy and chemically in other ways. They are everywhere, all the time. In like microbiology 101, the thing to do the first day of class, you take a petri dish, take off the lid, let it sit for the period of lecture, come back to the next lecture, and it's covered just from bacteria floating down into the dish. So I hope you're not a germaphobe, because you're going to lose. In the case of plant pathogens, they're spread by animals and water, typically. For example, is anyone familiar with fire blight of pear? That is spread, that's a bacterial disease. Do you know what spreads it? The bees. Bees spread it. Pollinators get it on them. It doesn't harm them at all, but they're going from flower to flower, doing their thing. Vicarious plant sex, right? The bacteria will get into the nectaries of the flower and then infect the rest of the plant, or the stem, that part of the stem. They're very tiny. This is a plant cell, just for size comparison. This is a fungal hyphae that's infecting the plant cell. It's a very small hyphae. And then here's a bacteria for comparison. They're orders of magnitude smaller than eukaryotic plant cells. They need a point of entry. This is an open stomate. Here's a stomatophore. And here are the guard cells. They're open. They're letting out water and letting in carbon dioxide. But you can actually see bacteria on the surface there. Isn't that cool? In the case of a bacterial wilt disease, like I talked about the fungal wilt on tomatoes, if there's a bacterial wilt disease, you can cut the stem and put it in water. And if you see streaming, it's called the ooze test. So if you see, put it in water, you start it, and you see an ooze coming out, that's just a bajillion bacteria coming out all at once. Okay. So the average tomato wilt, is it fungal or bacterial? I don't know. Cut it, put it in water. If it oozes, it's a bacterial wilt disease. Nothing you can do about it. Bacteria like fungi cause all sorts of diseases on all plant parts, from roots to reproductive tissue to leaves and stems, etc. We mentioned this already. This is Fusarium wilt. Despite sufficient watering, the plant is continuing to wilt because the tissue that is moving water and/or nutrients and/or primarily water nutrients is not functioning. So the above ground part of the plant cannot take advantage of the stuff that the roots are trying to do. We talked about this already. So this is a combination. This is a different wilt. Southern bacterial wilt. And there's no resistant varieties, there's no chemical treatments, it's a matter of crop rotation. Viruses are biological but not alive, in the sense that they're not actively metabolizing, and instead they're a little packet of genes that infect other cells and take advantage of cellular machinery to reproduce their own genetic material. And this is a very common pathogen transmitted by insects. Anything that is feeding on on a plant can have viruses in their saliva or their other insect fluids, and then it gets transmitted right into the plant. Or but they can also be transplanted in other ways, but primarily it's if they're insect vectors. These can be treated. They're not always fatal. Sometimes they are fatal. But when they can cause growth distortions, so occasionally pruning out can help, but usually the plant, in many viral cases, the plant can outgrow it. But there are others that they cannot, and I'll show you one in a second that's becoming a major issue on roses. The symptoms they cause will be mottling, as I mentioned earlier, and then they can also cause necrotic spots, and others will cause pretty dramatic growth distortions. Because the virus is distorting all of the cellular machinery, the plant can't grow normally, and so things can look weird. There are some witches' brooms, so a proliferation of stem growth at one node can be caused by a viral infection, for example. And I think I have, yes, okay, this is my favorite new viral disease. This is a viral disease of roses that is spread by a type of mite. And they are fatal to roses. If you see these symptoms on your rose, remove the rose. Burn it. Get rid of it. The symptoms would include, the coolest one, I think, is a proliferation of prickles. And roses have prickles. They don't have thorns. Thorns are a pointy stem. A spine is a pointy leaf, but a pointy epidermis is a prickle. So every rose has a prickle. So if you see a proliferation of prickles, and often those prickles are soft, not too hard and woody like normal prickles are. The new growth will also look dark red or purple. The new growth can also be distorted. The leaves aren't folding out right. Sometimes you see really long whips, so it's like a lot of rapid stem growth and not many leaves. But look out for this in your rose garden. This is spreading rapidly, primarily on knockout roses.
Showing up on knockouts.
Yes, primarily knockouts, almost universally knockouts.
Thank God.
Whoa.
Careful.
No, I like how people. I'm as interested in the plants people don't like as they like them. That's kind of funny. I also despise paper. I'm in the South. And I say that.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah. That's the last straw. I'm an Okie, so I can say that. Some people don't consider it the South, but I'm in Oklahoma, too much like the South. Finally, we'll wrap up briefly with nematodes, just so you're familiar with them. I didn't too much on nematodes in California, so I'm kind of sick of them, but they are soil organisms that are really diverse set of organisms. They are type of invertebrate. They have a really elegant internal anatomy that makes dissecting them, at least larger ones, exciting. Some of them can infect people, but there are a big group of nematodes that only infect plants, and those that infect plants cannot harm you, so don't be too scared of them. They feed on plants by a mouth part called a stylet. It's like this harpoon, and they'll pierce the plant cells and suck out the goodness inside. And so if you're into this sort of thing, if you identify nematodes, it's the shape and the size and some of the characters associated with their mouth part that helps identify species. If you're really masochistic, then you can hopefully get to tour the NCDA soil labs at some point. If you come to the Master Gardener Volunteer College, which I'm organizing, you can do this. Sign up today. You have until April 15th to sign up. And you have been distributing that, right, Ashley?
Mm-hmm. And we're going.
Good. Okay. You can learn all about this, but if you tour the lab, they have a whole set of technicians that spend 8 hours a day under these really elaborate microscopes, counting and identifying nematodes. So there are days that I envy them.
When we saw the counter in your hand.
Yeah. This is identical for it. So they're not all bad. They're a natural part of the soil ecosystem. Okay, there are many kinds of them. Some of them eat other nematodes, in fact, some big ones. But they're just part of the soil ecosystem. But they can, the plant parasitic nematodes vary in how they feed on plants. Some of them are called ectoparasites. They feed on the outside of plant tissue. Others are called endoparasites, so they feed on the inside of plant tissue. Some of them move around plant roots and stems. Others will find a spot after a certain life stage and stay there and just eat and eat and eat, grow and explode with eggs. Cool. There are some of them. Many of the ones that are easy to recognize are the secondary endoparasites. Those are called like the root knot nematodes, as the name implies. They produce little nodules on the roots, and those are in fact the highly inflated females surrounded by some plant tissue. There is a new species of root knot nematode called guava root knot nematode, Meloidogyne interlobii, that is potentially becoming a really, really bad issue for sweet potato growers. And we are the #1 sweet potato state. It has been a very important crop for tobacco producers, and so this is bad news. Stay tuned. So pay attention to that if you've heard when you look at guava root knot nematode. But there are others that are different sizes and damage plants in different ways. Just long story short. The damage they cause to plants, if they're not a root knot nematode, it can be hard to diagnose the problem as nematodes. And the only way to really get a verification of what it is to submit it to the lab. But some of the symptoms are what you would expect for something that's feeding on roots, right? You're going to see occasionally lesions, you'll see excessive branching of the roots, smaller roots, just they look kind of pitiful. And then above ground, for whatever reason, you eliminated other possibilities, but you can't determine why the above ground part of the plant is stunted or chlorotic or wilting otherwise. It might be a nematode issue. And soil testing costs $3. It's not a dissimilar sampling process to soils, except that you do submit them in a plastic bag to keep it moist, because you want to keep the critters alive for a few days. Here's a root knot nematode on tomato. You see the nodules from heavy infestations. Likewise on this yew, really distorted root growth. But above ground, oh good, it's killing boxwood. Then it's hard to say if what is the actual cause of that. I mean, in this case, we know it's root knot nematodes because they've sampled it, but there's all sorts of things that might be causing those above ground symptoms. All sorts of boxwood type stuff. In an orchard situation, I help with some god-awful research in using fumigants, and fortunately in almonds in California, almonds period is one place they go out in the world, except basically Turkey, Australia, and Spain, in large productions. You have to fumigate the soil intermittently every 20 years or so, because you get massive production losses if the nematodes damage almond roots when they're young. And so some of the research that I was instantly involved with was trying to find ways where if we have to use these fumigants, can we just put a little bit into the planting hole instead of the whole freaking field? And one interesting thing that came out of this research is that one alternative to a fumigant was just using steam. There's a really complex machine to go along and steam the soil. Actually, the steam killed more things than the fumigant did. And the native soil organisms bounce back faster after some of the fumigants and the steam. So that was an unfortunate surprise. Anyway, but I'm not doing that anymore, so. And now, there are some nematicides that are now labeled for lawns, right? But they're literally thousands of dollars per acre, thousands. And so only with fancy people with fancy golf course lawns in Wilmington could actually use this sort of thing when they're assessing lawns down there. So don't worry about it for our purposes. Do something else besides a lawn in the cool part of the triangle. Not as cool as Chapel Hill. Where I live. Yes. happy triangle family. At least we're not Atlanta, right? Oh, I got people. I have family in Atlanta. Okay, so what can you do in the garden? If you're having consistent nematode issues, you can plant more resistant crops for some interesting reason. The cold crops, so broccoli, scales, cabbages, let me call that. Those are relatively resistant to a lot of nematodes. Corn, asparagus tends to suffer less. There are, just like there are resistant tomato varieties to diseases, there are resistant tomato varieties to certain nematodes. Canola, certain forms of canola, when planted correctly, and I can get you an article about how to do this, they can, when incorporated into soil, suppress nematode populations. Soil stabilization can work to some degree. This is where you till in, wet the soil, apply a plastic cover, let it get really hot, and you're de facto partially fumigating the soil. Have you had this lecture on the plant disease and insect life? Should I review that for a second?
Yeah, you can review it.
Okay,
We've mentioned it a little bit, but we've mentioned it a little bit.
So whereas you're sending soil samples to the Department of Agriculture, that's a separate entity from us, and we're all either NC A&T State or NC State employees. But NC State has the pathogen lab, the plant disease and insect clinic. And if you can't diagnose, if me or Ashley or the agent can't diagnose, sometimes we can send samples to the clinic. It's a $20 fee through extension, but it's what, $25 or $30 if you just do it directly. And they have professional diagnosticians in the lab to identify diseases. There are certain ways to pack and ship and sample plant tissue to get a good diagnosis. So make sure those are followed properly to get a good diagnosis. But just search for this clinic, and they're also the folks that do the amazing plant pest and pathogen webinars. What is it, seasonally now, 6 times a year. They're really cool people. And Matt Bertone, who's the entomologist. Okay, I'm gonna make it fun entomologist for a second. Do you mind? Okay. Entomologists are the only group that botanists can relate to closely because only they understand how diverse life really is. You know, there's 25,000 species of orchids and 4,000 species of mammals, and a third of them are bats. So, you know, entomologists, that's cute. Yeah, 4,000 species. But in California, when we were trying to diagnose issues, sometimes if we thought it was an insect problem, we would always say, "I'm not an entomologist, but," and that protected us not only because we might get it wrong to an entomologist, but also we would be mistaken for entomologists. We're not that big. No, actually, I love entomologists. Okay, so now we have some first. There's 3 things. We do 4 things at once. It is now 10:11, so how about this? Questions for 3.78 minutes, and then I can go through the diagnostic lecture. We'll take our break, come back and do the exercise. The diagnostic lecture kind of frames the exercise. Is that a fair way to proceed? Mm-hmm. Okay, so questions on diseases first. Yes?
Bacteria have required opening.
Yeah.
I think in the chapter, it talked about if you're like trimming, not to put a sealer on it. Can you speak about sealers and that kind of thing?
Yeah. So, for example, if you're making pruning cuts, for example, old recommendations were to apply a sealant on a large pruning cut. The idea being that you are you're closing the wound. But in fact, those sealants did a poorer job than the plant's natural healing process. And so a properly done pruning cut, where you're right at the collar, will cause callus tissue to form around the pruning cut in a way that plants can, for the most part, handle. There is a window of time wherein, yes, theoretically, infection could occur, but they found that actually applying sealants in the way the sealants break down and the way that the plant tissue goes around the sealants after time can cause situations where it makes it, in fact, more vulnerable to later infection. Yeah, but generally, it's basically you're letting the plant do the healing job better than paintbrush and tar.
Is there an optimum enough
I would say in some parts of the country, in some climates, perhaps, in Mediterranean climates, you want to do it when it's drier out. The reason there's so much grown in California is because the Mediterranean climate is wettest in winter. It stops raining in April. In the past 5 years, it's stopped raining period. But in the southeast, it's wet and warm a lot. So in theory, you could, if you see an issue develop because of pruning wounds, for example, pruning in winter, there's going to be less pathogens active, I suppose. But the reason for pruning in winter is usually a more physiological one. You're trying to prune things out before growth occurs. But yes, in theory, the wetter and warmer it is, the more likely infection could occur, all things being equal.
What do you recommend for sterilizing shoes and tools and things that can spread disease?
Certainly to kill pathogens, a 1 to 10 dilution of bleach is effective, but that can cause tools to rust if you don't dry them off thoroughly. 70% ethanol is really effective, and it's actually more effective, I think, than 95% ethanol. It's based on how the ethanol interacts with the actual pathogen versus if it's in pure form, it helps to have diluted. So 70% ethanol, and then Lysol works great too. Yeah, usually. When in laboratory situations where we're cleaning instruments, ethanol is kind of effective.
And that's Lysol, white spray liquid, any kind of Lysol.
Yeah, I think that most of those should be pretty effective. Yeah. But ethanol is my favorite because you can light it on fire. Yeah.
So we have a mat sale and we wash off our pots. If we just spray some Lysol in it, is that okay? I have a friend who.
I would, well, pots, I mean,
That's a little too much.
yeah, with pots, I think you're probably safer in thoroughly rinsing it and then 5 minutes in a bleach solution and then thorough rinse. That's probably easier to do. Because you don't want to, you want to remove the debris too.
Okay, what
So-
about vinegar?
Probably not as, I don't know for certain, but I bet it's less effective than bleachers. Yeah. I think, yeah, I think it is.
I have one other question. I don't know if this is, I have a lot of hypoxia canker with the deciduous trees, and I have lots of lichen on the trees in my property. But I always thought the lichen had sort of a symbiotic relationship to help with necrotic outer bark, the bark of the tree, that it wasn't bad. I mean, everything is good if it's under control, right? So I'm noticing the hypoxia canker and then also the lichen. Is there a correlation, a relationship there or not?
Just to clarify again, lichens are not ever causing the disease. They are growing on the plant, and if you see a lot of lichen, it means the plant is growing slowly, potentially. I don't know of any correlation between those two at all. The types of fungi that are in symbiotic relationships with algae that create the lichen are not the same type of fungi that infect plants. For the most, as far as I know. Yeah, but good question. Anything else? Yeah.
Question, and it's probably an environmental issue, but it's a symptom that I've seen in different trees, pines, fruit trees, and that is where the stem will come up out of the ground and dramatically step in, and the stem will continue up.
So it's constricted at the base?
Correct. And I've heard it called different things like blood swell, other things.
Is it uniformly constricted, or is it
Yes,
kind of?
absolutely, yeah.
That sounds like it's some. Wow.
I've heard it been attributed to nutrients or maybe shallow soil. I don't know.
Yeah, I've not heard of that symptom. Can you show me? So it's referred to as butt swell.
I've heard in the forestry industry it's called
Yeah.
butt swell. And there's actually a stand of loblolly pines in Shank Forest where you see it quite pronounced.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, based on the description, it sounds like some environmental issue that at some stage of the seedling's growth it interfered in how it was that was forming. I don't know of any a symptom like that would be caused by pathogen. Does anyone know anything else about that? That's a new one to me, so I'm open up. Cool. Yeah, but probably environmental. Yeah, go ahead.
I've seen in our neighborhood, the volcanic mulching
Uh-huh.
of young trees.
Right.
And it looks like as the trees have aged, 5 to 10 years, you can see the roots up there. Has that really destabilized that tree? Would a wind take it down or?
Yeah, all the above. So they're for trees like one that's going on, and in some cases they can produce. The word has left me suddenly. Well, there are situations where plants can grow tissues where they normally can't grow tissues. So they're producing root tissue out of stem tissue, and adventitious growth. That's what I'm thinking. And so at that point they're trying to grow in the volcano, which they think is soil. And so if the root mass starts to accumulate in there, and it's getting by, surviving like that, you remove the mulch, that could really stabilize it. So yeah, it's
What should people do with it?
pray,
Okay.
ritual sacrifice. I mean, it's hard to. I would.
Bring in soil and pack it around it, or just?
I might try to remove the mulch and.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah.
Because I have somebody working on that
Oh,
in my
nice.
yard right now.
Yeah, go for it.
That they are removing all the mulch and digging out the soil, cutting off the adventitious roots.
Yeah.
And creating like more of a basin.
I see. Okay.
Because my trees were planted too deeply.
Oh, I see. So it's kind of
And
yeah.
so
Rather than
it caused the same kind of situation.
so they're almost redoing the grade at that point. Interesting.
Yeah, but they have to dig out, cut off all the adventitious roots.
Yeah.
Because those were girdling.
Yeah. That's an operation. Okay, one last one.
Okay, I have a very provocative question. I do not have an irrigation system on property. I have a theory that more diseases and everything is caused by irrigation because we're already a wet area, as you were saying.
Yeah.
I mean, can you speak to that? What is your?
Well, I mean, not irrigation per se, but certainly overwatering. Yeah. I mean, if people have automatic timers and watering that's not necessary, sure. Now, can a pathogen travel down an irrigation system? I guess theoretically.
But has there been research on that or?
Well, what immediately comes to mind is there's a insect called a granny-wet and beetle in nurseries typically, and what happens is the beetle will burrow into the trunk and they actually raise a fungus inside the plant and feed the fungus to the young, and they produce almost toothpicks that come out inside. But what attracts the beetle to the plants is ethanol, and when plants are overwatered in a container situation particularly, anoxic conditions occur and ethanolic respiration, instead of fermentation occurs inside the media that produces alcohol, and that attracts the beetles. So yeah, the excess moisture can, in some cases, attract and cause other issues too. Yes. Great.
So, no, I was gonna say part of it too is the method of irrigation, right? So like a sprinkler is gonna
Okay,
be
yes,
more
good,
of that
good.
dropping pattern
Good,
than
good.
something like a drip line.
Correct. Yeah. If you continuously wet the tissue from overhead irrigation, that definitely, anytime the leaf is wet, it creates a better opportunity, more opportunity for a successful infection to occur.
What else?
But if you have poor drainage,
Then the drip would still be an issue.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and do. It's 10:20. How do we feel? Want to do an early thing, or I'll talk quickly? And then we'll break. Okay. I'll talk even more quickly. Can you imagine that? Okay, just throw something at me, and I'll slow down. Talk amongst yourselves. Actually, I gotta find the presentation. So let's do the social committee.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Let's do a break and we'll just come back in half an hour.
Cool.
Can you go back to the virus?
Yes.
Or something?
Yeah.
Have a chance